Thank you very much, and welcome. It's great to see such a fantastic turnout. Thanks to Patricia Restrepo, curator of the Olivia Erlanger exhibition, for inviting me to participate, and to Jet Torres, public programs and CAMH lab manager, and Felice Cleveland, the museum's director of learning and engagement, for facilitating this talk. Thanks also to Sean Roberts and Shane Smith for their help in securing photographs for this talk. Artist Olivia Erlanger challenges us to critically reconsider the mythology of home, effectively, the ways that middle-class domesticity is sold to us, and the effects of that mythology on the construction of US cities and of US modernity. And of course, what better place to throw down this challenge than Houston, which prides itself on shaping its own defiantly populist version of unconstrained modernity. When Patricia Restrepo, Jet Torres, and Felice Cleveland and I first discussed my participation, I almost instantly thought of the central city neighborhood of Riverside Terrace, a middle to upper middle income subdivision developed in stages from the mid-1920s to the late 1940s. Riverside Terrace is fascinating because it is one of the places in Houston where tomorrow collided with today, throwing into question the smug assurances that the middle-class myth of suburban home as perpetually secure and privileged presumes. I understand the myth of suburban security to constitute one of the ideological closed worlds that Olivia Erlanger addresses in her installation. And if I play with the little arrow, this is Alameda Road. You of course recognize Herman Park. This is Brays Bayou. And this is Riverside Terrace, sort of beginning up at Blodgett and sort of working its way down. It was developed, as you'll see, in basically two clumps, one in the 1920s north of Brays Bayou, the other from the 1930s to the 1940s in this long linear stretch on the south side of the bayou. Ms. Erlanger begins her installation with Eros, her pointed diagram of the night sky above Houston on the day in 1880 before Thomas Edison patented the light bulb. 2 years later, as you can see on the right, the Houston Electric Light and Power Company was in business. As the historian Harold Platt determined when writing his book about Houston, City Building in the New South, electricity and other modern public services in late 19th century Houston were neither cheap nor reliable. That's a laugh line. The stride of modern services that radically changed the nature of city life in the last quarter of the 19th century did not bypass Houston. The Houston City Gas Light Company, here on the right, it manufactured gas for artificial lighting prior to the availability of electricity, was organized in 1866. The Houston Water Works Company followed at the end of the 1870s. This was its plant on Buffalo Bayou, where the Aquarium restaurant is now located. Streetcar service was introduced to Houston in 1868. In 1890, the Omaha, Nebraska investor O.M. Carter bought and consolidated Houston's two competing streetcar companies and electrified the system. The switch from mule-drawn public transportation to electrified transit meant vehicles could travel longer distances than mule cars in much shorter times, facilitating Carter's development in 1891-92 of the comparatively distant and ambitiously scaled Houston Heights. Historian Sam Bass Warner popularized use of the term streetcar suburbs to recognize the connection that such US developers as O.M. Carter made between electrification, urban mass transit, and suburban real estate development, enabling middle-income wage earners to work in the city and live, if not in the country, at least on the city's outskirts. One entrepreneur who understood the connection between transit, property, and profit was Henry F. McGregor, an officer of one of the two streetcar companies. McGregor left streetcar management in 1903 to become a developer of suburban Houston real estate. McGregor tied his development to Houston's South End, the city blocks south of the downtown business district along the axis of Main Street, where Houston's elite families built their towered Victorian houses during the last quarter of the 19th century. After the turn of the 20th century, elite residential development moved south into what we now call Midtown. This is a 1919 aerial view of the South End Junior High School, today the San Jacinto campus of Houston Community College, surrounded by blocks of columned colonial revival houses. I think 3 of them still exist. H.F. McGregor and his brother-in-law and partner, Frank J. Demerit, platted the Southmore and Kenilworth Grove subdivisions in 1909 and the Blodgett Park subdivision in 1915, all located in what in the 1970s came to be called the Benz neighborhood, where the Asia Society Texas Center and the Children's Museum are located. While the headline for this ad from the Houston Post in May 1909 may seem crass, it represents the way that new residential real estate was marketed in early 20th century Houston as a smart investment in Houston's future. Olivia Erlanger meditates on how speculation of both the financial and imaginative kind shapes cities. Another ad from 1909 promotes Southmore's proximity to the campus of the Rice Institute, which you see on the right in this aerial view from 1920, and the impending extension of Houston's streetcar line all the way south to the new Bel Air Boulevard. Olivia Erlanger emphasizes what she describes as vascular systems, the circulation networks that link the planetarium of closed suburban worlds to each other and to such traditional economic centers as downtown. The image of Rice's campus evokes Erlanger's park diorama with its coordination of axial movement and view. This map shows Houston's South End street grid as it stood in 1923, the year that H.F. McGregor died. McGregor and Demerit had accumulated real estate east of Southmore and Alameda Road. Again, this is Alameda Road, bounding the east side of Herman Park. Here is the Southmore neighborhood, and this is sort of the property that they had assembled for future development. Note that this map shows the engineering interventions made to eliminate 2 big meanders on the bayou. One, where it says 258, where State Highway 288 and the H.E.B. McGregor Market are located, and the other, where it says 163, where Riverside Park between North and South Calumet Drives is located. So again, these were meanders of the bayou that were cut off to straighten it. In 1924, McGregor's widow, Peggy Stevens McGregor, and F.J. Demerit sold this 176-acre tract to Clarence M. Malone's Riverside Land Company to enable Malone to develop it as the subdivision of Riverside Terrace. C.M. Malone, as he was known professionally, would develop Riverside Terrace in 22 sections between 1924 and 1946. In addition to his activity as a real estate developer, Malone was vice president of the Guardian Trust Company, one of the 2 Houston trust companies that specialized in financing and managing subdivision development during the 1920s. Malone and his brother Clayton E. Malone, manager of the Guardian Trust Company's real estate department, worked from offices in the Niels Esperson building downtown, following its completion in 1926. James A. Baker of the Baker and Botts law firm was chairman of the board of directors of the Guardian Trust Company. Newspaper reports on development of the first sections of Riverside Terrace in 1924 and 25 emphasized the paving of Alameda Road along with installation of a storm sewer that could rapidly drain the flat coastal plain. Note that this diagram, published in May 1923, shows engineering interventions being made well upstream along Bray's Bayou, that's sort of to the left, to systematically cut off meanders and rectify the channel so that flood water could flow rapidly to the bayou's confluence with the Houston Ship Channel, which is, of course, here on the far east. In August 1924, the first lot sale occurred in Riverside Terrace. Newspaper reports in the fall of 1924 described the construction of natural gas, water, electricity, and telephone distribution networks, and the concrete paving of all streets and sidewalks. A progress report in the Chronicle in July 1925 asserted it was, quote, probably the most picturesque addition in Houston, due to the fact that it is covered with beautiful oak and pine trees, close quote. Although the subhead of this article from October 1925 states otherwise. This particular article contained information about the origin of Riverside Terrace that is quite specific. It describes how H.F. McGregor, in assembling this tract, had not been able to acquire what the article refers to as, quote, a number of small tracts owned by Negroes, close quote, but that C.M. Malone was able to negotiate the sale of these tracts and secure displacement of what the article describes as, quote, Negro colonies, close quote, with their residents, quote, moved into Negro additions where the surroundings were better suited to them, close quote. The legal infrastructure of Riverside Terrace included deed restrictions, with a clause excluding ownership or occupancy of property by African Americans, except for those employed as servants. The first 4 sections of Riverside Terrace were developed from Blodgett Avenue on the north to Riverside Drive on the south, along the subdivision's west edge on Alameda Road. So again, here is Alameda. As you can see on the adjacent city map to the right, Riverside Terrace initially extended the orthogonal street and block pattern of Houston's South End, as McGregor's Southmore subdivision had done earlier. The houses built in these sections were representative of middle-income housing constructed in contemporaneous Houston subdivisions. Along Arbor Avenue at the north edge of the neighborhood, brick veneer duplexes were constructed in what was otherwise a neighborhood of single-family houses. The builder R.H. Pence erected this picturesque manorial duplex in 1927, while the prolific house-building corporation, the Russell Brown Company, erected this Georgian-style brick veneer duplex on Whitworth Avenue in 1928. The one-story suburban cottage was a popular Houston house type, an example of which is the brick veneer manorial cottage that builder W.J. Goggin constructed on Prospect Avenue in 1926. Henry H. Yates was one of several residential contractors who built multiple houses in Riverside Terrace. The Houston Post described Yates's brick veneer cottage on Oakdale Avenue of 1927 as a Dutch-style bungalow. The grandest houses in the first 4 sections of Riverside Terrace were built on Rosedale Avenue, beginning with the Georgian-style house of Judge and Mrs. J.W. Lockett, constructed in 1926 at 2303 Rosedale. Judge Lockett's sister was married to Otis Stevens Vandermark, the nephew of Peggy Stevens McGregor. The Vandermarks lived 2 doors away at 2311 Rosedale. Next door to Judge Lockett's house is the Italianate house that architect Joseph Finger designed for Mildred Powell and Verner H. McCall in 1929 at 2221 Rosedale. And next to the McCall house is the Georgian-style house of Mrs. McCall's sister, Roberta Powell, and her husband, Charles A. Dwyer, completed in 1930. Missing from this lineup, because it has been demolished, is the house that Joseph Finger designed for Mrs. McCall and Mrs. Dwyer's aunt, the widow of M.M. Graves, built next to the Dwyer house in 1931. These houses reflect the sophisticated architectural type of the country house, the preferred suburban elite house type of the 1920s and 30s. In contrast to the string of country houses on Rosedale, most houses built in the first 4 sections of Riverside Terrace were examples of more conventional U.S. suburban house types. The Isidore Schwartz House of 1928 at 2402 Prospect is what architectural historians would now describe as a 4-square house type because of its cubic proportions. Its deep-set porches and buff brick veneer finish were representative of middle-income housing in Houston during the 1920s. As can be seen at the house of the lawyer Harry W. Freeman of 1928 at 2316 Rosedale and Emancipation, also faced with a mixed blend of buff brick and capped by a hipped red tile roof. The Freeman House was designed by the Houston architect Leonard Gabbard, the first graduate of the Rice Institute's architecture department. The modest bungalow-type house Gabbard built for his family still survives at 2311 Arbor Avenue. The Freeman House exists, but the tile roof was replaced in 2019, and the brick was painted and all the original windows replaced in 2023. A newcomer to the Houston home building scene, Catherine B. Mott, made her debut in Riverside Terrace in 1927. In early 1928, Mrs. Mott and her husband and business partner, Harry L. Mott, completed construction of their first venture in Houston, this house at 2428 Southmore Boulevard. This picturesque manorial-type house, now occupied by the Black United Front, was much more sophisticated architecturally than other houses built speculatively in Riverside Terrace. Working with the Indianapolis architects Burns and James, the Motts were from Indianapolis, Catherine Mott built houses for sale that were comparable in design quality to the larger country houses on Rosedale. Riverside Terrace was where the Motts launched their career in Houston. The contrast I draw between conventional middle-income house types and styles and Catherine Mott's work bespeaks a turning point in Houston residential real estate practices in the mid-1920s. This turning point revolved around River Oaks, its development announced in June 1924, almost concurrently with the announcement of Riverside Terrace. Developed by the brothers Will and Mike Hogg, their sister Ima Hogg, and the Hogg's business associate Hugh Potter, River Oaks represented the civic ambitions of Will Hogg, who was determined that River Oaks be a model for how the city of Houston could develop. The River Oaks Corporation dramatically raised expectations about standards of neighborhood planning, neighborhood identity, and neighborhood style, all promoted through the medium of advertising. The development of Allen Parkway, beginning in 1924, linked River Oaks to the new downtown Civic Center on the east and Memorial Park on the west, here of course being River Oaks, both of which Will Hogg was instrumental in creating. In spring 1926, Peggy Stevens McGregor announced that the H.F. McGregor Estate would donate 110 acres to the city of Houston for a park along Brays Bayou, as well as funds to acquire right-of-way on either side of the Bayou Channel to connect McGregor Park to Herman Park with flanking parkway drives. The report of the City Planning Commission, published in 1929 by Will Hogg, and that's where this image comes from, shows the new parkways. Again, Allen Parkway here in the upper register, and the McGregor Parkway in the lower register, demonstrating how dueling Houston philanthropists could integrate public improvement projects with neighborhood planning to transform Houston into a modern garden city. Section 5 of Riverside Terrace, where improvements began in spring 1927, was where C.M. Malone jettisoned the conventional right-angled street grid of Riverside's first 4 sections for a pastoral planning approach of curving streets outlining topographically varied sites as Riverside Terrace finally gained frontage on its river, Gray's Bayou. Here you see the impact that River Oaks exerted on Riverside Terrace. Looking east on Riverside Drive, where it dips to intersect with Live Oak Street, you become aware of the topographic variety that exists in Section 5. Returning to the map I showed earlier, I point out the cut-off channel of the meander of Bray's Bayou that became the right-of-way of Live Oak. And the location of Riverside Park, around which North and South Calumet Drives divide. The Guardian Trust Company's advertising began to emphasize the landscape appeal of Section 5, as it had not done with the earlier 4 sections. C.M. Malone built his family's house at South Calumet Drive and Live Oak Street in 1928 on a wooded multi-acre site overlooking Riverside Park. The picturesque manorial style of Malone's house alternated with the Georgian symmetry visible in the J.C. Leonard House on the opposite side of the park on North Calumet Drive, also of 1928. Occupying the multi-acre site where H.E.B. is now located was the Edward W. Turner House of 1929, an Italianate villa design. Also pictured in Houston, A History and Guide, the American Guide Series Guidebook to Houston of 1942, to represent the architectural splendor of Riverside Drive. One of Riverside Terrace's landmarks is this 2- and 3-story tower house at Riverside and Live Oak of 1929, designed by architect Charles A. Demon for a retired Sulphur Company executive, Charles Bissell. The houses that stood out architecturally in Section 5 were those built by Catherine Mott and her husband Harry. This is a photo of Catherine Mott from Lucia Benton's 2011 thesis, The Houses of Catherine Mott. On the right, an illustrated ad for Modern Homecraft, the Mott's house building operation, picturing the H.C. Dollahite House on North McGregor Way in Riverside Terrace. All of Catherine and Harry Mott's houses were designed by the Indianapolis architects Burns and James. All were examples of the picturesque manorial country house type. This is Moss-side, the name the house's first owner gave to it, located on North McGregor Way. The Guardian Trust Company advertised Riverside with the Mott's houses, Moss-side on the left, the Ingleside on Riverside Drive on the right. Harry Mott was the builder of record for the largest of the Mott's houses in Riverside Terrace, the Dr. Charles M. Lusk House at the intersection of Riverside Drive and North McGregor Way of 1929, rehabilitated to become the law office of Sean Roberts. Despite the onset of the Great Depression in October 1929, the momentum of Houston's construction scene meant that into 1930, new houses continued to be built, such as the multi-gabled W.G. Jones House of 1930 at Arbor Avenue and Emancipation, designed by architect Lamarque Cato. The columned A.C. Sorrell House at North Calumet and Innis Street, perhaps better remembered as the Groovy Grill, was built in 1930. As was this picturesque manorial house at 2421 Southmore, an early work of the designer builder J. Leon Osborne. And the house of Judge Ed R. Campbell on the curve at Live Oak and Wichita. Designed by the architect William D. Bordeaux, the Campbell House was the first example in Houston of a Monterey-type house. The impact of the Depression may be the reason that furniture dealer Sam Finger, for whom this exceptionally well-maintained house at 2520 Rosedale and Live Oak was built in 1931, sold the house soon after its completion. I was not able to identify an architect for this house, but it looks very much like the house Leonard Gabbert designed for Harry Freeman, just a block away. The rapid development of Riverside Terrace drew commercial and institutional uses to Almeda Road, which connected Riverside directly to downtown Houston. Cars, instead of streetcars, were how Riverside Terrace's modern residents traveled. Exemplifying the architectural eclecticism of the 1920s were such structures as the Italianate Byzantine Third Church of Christ Scientist of 1928, now the Parador, at Almeda and Benz. The no longer extant Art Deco-style clubhouse of Houston's oldest German social club, the Houston Trendverein, by architect Joseph Finger of 1929 at Almeda and Southmore. And the Spanish-style patio shops of 1930 by B.W. Holtz and H.M. Sanford at Almeda and Palm, a suburban shopping center designed to be accessed by cars. The Guardian Trust Company was not subtle in appropriating the visage of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in July 1933 to urge Houstonians to fight back against the Depression by buying a new house, in Riverside Terrace, of course. The years 1931 to 1934 were dismal years for Houston's real estate and construction economy. But the successful adoption of prorationing, authorizing the Texas Railroad Commission to set monthly limits on the amount of oil that could be extracted from wells, stabilized the price of oil in the United States, and resulted in an economic rebound, at least for middle and upper income Houstonians by 1935. This was reflected in a resurgence of construction in Riverside Terrace and other affluent Houston neighborhoods. In Riverside Terrace, the neighborhood's mid-1930s turnaround marked its new social role as the Jewish River Oaks, as Riverside would come to be described. Pre-World War I elite Houston neighborhoods, such as Montrose, did not practice discrimination against Jewish families, nor in the 1920s did emerging middle-income Houston subdivisions, such as Southampton. Although such small proprietary elite neighborhoods as Cortland Place of 1906, Shadyside of 1916, and Broad Acres of 1922 had no Jewish residents, it was with the development of River Oaks, beginning in 1924, that Jewish exclusion became a factor with which affluent Houston Jewish families had to contend in making decisions about where to live. In River Oaks, Jews were not excluded by stated policy. I've never encountered any Houston deed restriction language that excluded any class of buyers or residents other than African Americans. What was used instead was the exclusionary device of the gentleman's agreement, as it's called in real estate terminology, the unwritten agreement, or conspiracy, if you will, not to show real estate to members of an excluded class. River Oaks did have Jewish residents, but they were the exception, not the rule. Riverside Terrace and Braeswood, down Braes Bayou on Main Street, were the two aspiring elite neighborhoods that in the mid-1930s welcomed prospective Jewish purchasers. I've shown the houses that Harry Freeman and Sam Finger built on Rosedale, and mentioned that architect Leonard Gabbert and his family lived in Riverside. Well-to-do Jewish families building in Riverside Terrace in the 1930s raised the neighborhood's architectural profile by commissioning well-known Houston architects to design their houses. The savings and loan executive Israel Friedlander commissioned Birdsell P. Briscoe to design his picturesque manorial-type house on Riverside Drive in Section 5 in 1935. The retail merchants of Main Street were well represented in this construction surge. R.S. Jarrett of the Pincus and Jarrett Dry Goods Company built this brick-faced, stone-trim, picturesque manorial house on Riverside Drive in 1936. Leonard Gabbert was the architect. Architecturally conservative on the outside, the Jarrett house possesses remarkable interior detailing with an Art Deco flair, preserved and restored by the present owner, lawyer Sean Roberts. Louis Leon, owner of Louis Leon the Smart Shop on Main Street, hired Catherine Mott's architects, Burns and James of Indianapolis, along with Leonard Gabbert as local associate architect, to design what the Houston Post described as the Leon's, quote, French Fontainebleau, close quote, style country house on South Calumet Drive overlooking Riverside Park in 1936. As had been true in the 1920s, the picturesque manorial country house remained an architectural favorite in Riverside Terrace, evidenced by the house that lumberyard owner Hugh I. Stallman built on North Calumet in 1937, when he and his family moved to Houston from Dallas. The Stallmans were not Jewish. Riverside Terrace also attracted affluent, non-Jewish residents who might otherwise have chosen to live in River Oaks. Although lumberman Wesley West's flamboyant brother, Silver Dollar Jim West, built an opulent Spanish-style house on River Oaks Boulevard in the early 1930s, Wesley West and his wife Neva worked with the West family's favorite architect, Joseph Finger, who was Jewish, on the design of their asymmetrically massed country house on Riverside Drive of 1938, unfortunately no longer standing. Today met tomorrow in 1937, when Lithuanian immigrants Rose Stein and Ben Proler and their children moved from Ben Proler's scrap metal yard on Clinton Drive into a steel-framed, flat-roofed, modernistic house at Riverside Drive in North McGregor Way. Although architect Bailey Swinson's rendering shows the house with open steel casement windows, that would no longer be necessary, since the Proler house, as the construction announcement states, was equipped with central air conditioning. You can see from a site plan diagram how architect Swenson extrapolated the house's bull-nosed corner entry bay from the geometry of the Riverside-McGregor Street intersection. Although the Proler house appears to be in terrible condition, new owner Sean Roberts says it was so well built that the damage is cosmetic rather than structural. Thanks to the stewardship of longtime owners, the Shapiro-Berkowitz family, the house is intact. The sinuous stair, with its sensational aluminum rail, winds up to the second floor, inside the stacked steel casement window bay. Even such details as the upholstered bar remain in place. The Prolers were not the only clients for modern architecture in Riverside. Oil company executive Lucius M. Lamar commissioned Fred McKee and Carl Kamrath to design his family's two-story, flat-roofed modern house on Palmer Street in Riverside Extension in 1941. I return to this area map because we're going to move from Riverside Terrace's sections developed in the 1920s, again here, all on the north bank of Brays Bayou and west of the International and Great Northern Railroad line, to those developed in the 1930s and 40s, sections 8 through 22, on the south side of Brays Bayou and east of the railroad. The last section, section 22, which is here south of McGregor Park, was developed in 1946. It lies just south of Old Spanish Trail. In section 10 on Parkwood Drive, one has the Betty and Abe M. Battlestein house of 1940, designed by Joseph Finger, confronting across the street the Ray Baum and Abe Weingarten house of 1938, also designed by Joseph Finger. The Battlestein's grandson, Bob Sussman, told me that one day his grandfather got a call from his best friend, Abe Weingarten, who told Mr. Battlestein, "I just bought a lot on Parkwood, and you're going to buy the lot across the street." That's how the two Joseph Finger designed houses came to face each other. Joseph Finger was the architect for multiple additions and alterations to Battlestein's, the Main Street clothes store Abe Battlestein operated with his father and brothers. Finger was also the architect for J. Weingarten Incorporated, the grocery market chain operated by Abe Weingarten and his brothers. Joseph Finger designed the biggest house built in Riverside Terrace, the Malvina Kessler and Joe Weingarten house of 1939, which occupies a 4.7-acre site at 4000 South McGregor Way in Section 12. Leonard Gabbert designed the house that Joe and Abe Weingarten's sister Ann and her husband Irving Alexander built at 3510 South McGregor Way in Section 10 in 1946. You can easily get caught up in the dynastic connections linking these merchant families. On the north side of Brays Bayou, not in Riverside Terrace, Mrs. Abe Weingarten's younger sister, Ann Baum, and her husband, Bernard Sakowitz, built their columned country house at 3533 North McGregor Way in 1939. Joseph Finger was also their architect. Like all the country houses built on estate-sized lots along North McGregor between Ardmore and Calhoun, the Sakowitz house no longer exists. Nor does the house known as the Anchorage, built in 1939 by the owner of a trucking company, C.E. Edwards, on a 5-acre site at 3101 North McGregor Way in Ardmore. From 1947 until 1958, this was the Pierre M. Schlumberger estate. Associated with this period in the neighborhood's history are such sites as Congregation Beth Yeshurun Synagogue, built in 1949 for Houston's conservative congregation. Designed by Joseph Finger and his partner George Rustay, it was located at Southmore Boulevard in Tearwester Street. It no longer exists. In 1950, the first purpose-built Jewish community center was constructed on Herman Drive, backing up to the Herman Park Golf Course. Leonard Gabbert and his partner, W. Jackson Wisdom, were architects. Overlooking Herman Park is the 16-story 1400 Herman Drive apartments, completed in 1958 by New York developer Lewis Cowan. 1400 Herman was where families could retire when they gave up their big houses in Riverside Terrace. Ray and Abe Weingarten, Malvina and Joe Weingarten, Bernard Sakowitz's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tobias Sakowitz, and architect Joseph Finger's widow, Gertrude Levy Finger, were among the early residents of 1400 Herman. Alameda Road continued to be a magnet for such popular businesses as Spanish Village, opened in a 1920s era house by Jimmy Holmes in 1949. In the 1950s, Riverside Terrace became the epicenter of a distinctive modern Houston house type, the Riverside Terrace Contemporary. Architect Bailey Swinson produced an early example of this house type in the 1- and 2-story P.R. Daniel Jr. house of 1950 at 4505 North Roseneath Drive in Section 15. The second story, projecting above the low, continuous eave line of the predominantly 1-story house, the vertical slot illuminating the interior stairwell, and the mixture of brick veneer and wood board and batten siding were identifying attributes of the Riverside contemporary house. Swinson explained that Riverside's deed restrictions mandated 2-story houses, but clients wanted 1-story ranch-type houses. The architectural solution is what Swinson called the mother-in-law room. A second-floor bedroom popped up above the 1-story house. Next door at 4511 North Roseneath, Swinson's architectural competitors in Riverside, Philip Willard and his partner Lucian Hood, designed the Mildred and Bernard Rabinowitz house of 1952 with its curved, vertically corrugated 2-story glass corner. Willard and Hood produced another exuberant interpretation of the type, capped by ascending roof planes, in their 1- and 2-story steel-framed house of 1953 in Section 10 for Florence Shapiro and Sammy P. Finger Jr. More subdued was the no longer extant, flat-roofed modular house that Albuquerque's best-known modern architect, the Texas-born Max Flato, designed for the family of his brother Tobias Flato at 3807 South McGregor Way in 1953. The Houston modern architect Howard Barnstone disdained the Riverside Terrace contemporary look, which he thought was showy and crass. Barnstone's corrective is visible in the house on North Roseneath in Section 15 that he designed for his cousin Evelyn Fink and her husband Morris G. Rosenthal in 1953. Barnstone's Rosenthal house was influenced by the house Philip Johnson had designed for Dominique and John de Menil. What interrupted modern architecture's trajectory in Riverside Terrace was the impact that Houston's post-World War II growth and expansion would exercise on the neighborhood. This is another diagram from the report of the City Planning Commission of 1929. It maps African American residential occupation in Houston at the end of the 1920s. A close-up shows the likely path of expansion for Houston's Third Ward African American neighborhoods. So here is Main Street, here is Montrose Boulevard, here we are, Herman Park, and so this is 1929. Third Ward lay just north of the white neighborhoods of Washington Terrace and then here Riverside Terrace. Deed restrictions with their racial exclusionary clause legally guarded the color line along Alabama Avenue, which is about here. The void along Alabama Avenue on the east would be filled in with CUNY Homes, Houston's first public housing community completed in 1940. The Houston Independent School District acquired a 53-acre site across Cleburne Avenue from CUNY Homes in 1944, again in this void, with funds generated by tuitions paid by students attending Houston College for Negroes, the African-American counterpart of the University of Houston. In 1947, the Regents of the University of Houston transferred ownership of the 53 acres and the one academic building that had been constructed there to the state of Texas to become the campus of Texas Southern University, the first state-supported university in Houston, and the first state university, rather than college, open to African American students in Texas. The Texas state legislature took this step to undercut the legal argument advanced by a Houston postal worker, Heman Sweat, who in 1944 had been admitted to the University of Texas Law School, the only public law school in Texas, but denied admission once university authorities realized Sweat was African American. Sweat lost a lawsuit he brought to gain admission and the ensuing appeal of the initial trial decision. But in 1950, the US Supreme Court reversed the lower court decisions and ordered the University of Texas to admit Sweat because there was no law school at Prairie View, then the only state college in Texas that admitted African Americans. Texas Southern University provided the economic foundation supporting the emergence of a substantial black middle class in Houston in the 1950s. In April 1952, J.M. Goldberg sold his house at 2202 Wichita Avenue and Hutchins to Stacy B. Smith, a white man, who then sold the house to Jack Caesar, an African American cattle buyer. Because the US Supreme Court ruled in the case of Buchanan versus Worley in 1917 that zoning ordinances could not be used for the purpose of racial exclusion, deed restrictions had instead been used for that purpose, a practice upheld by the Supreme Court in 1926. But in Shelley versus Kramer, a 1948 decision, the Supreme Court reversed its 1926 ruling to hold that racial exclusionary restrictions were not enforceable. This meant that the sale to Jack Caesar could not be voided as a violation of Riverside's deed restrictions. The result was a nearly year-long campaign of harassment of the Caesar household that escalated when, in July 1953, a house at 2412 Wichita was first sold to a white buyer, then resold to an African American buyer, Mrs. Maddie Hilliard. In April 1953, a bomb exploded on the front porch of the Caesars house. No one was injured, but the attack prompted what would become an exodus of white families from the northern sections of Riverside Terrace. Two men, one of them a neighbor of the Caesars, were convicted in the bombing. The result, though, was not to scare African Americans out of seeking to buy property in Riverside Terrace, but to scare white families into leaving the neighborhood. In July 1957, C.M. Malone gave his house on North Calumet to the University of Houston. A year later, Pierre Schlumberger and Abe Weingarten each gave their houses to the University of Houston. In 1963, the Jack Shanock House at 2500 Southmore Boulevard was purchased by Mrs. Ella Rose Sweat. Mrs. Sweat was the mother of Heman Sweat. This photograph from Eric Slotboom's book, Houston Freeways, shows the right-of-way of State Highway 288, the South Freeway, cleared through the west edge of Riverside Terrace in 1972. When I came to Houston in the fall of 1969, this is how I encountered Riverside Terrace. The east-west streets were still open to traffic, but all the buildings and vegetation were gone. In the discourse of 20th century American urbanism, as national policy tilted towards suburban expansion after the Second World War, freeway construction is routinely criticized for the destructive impact it had on low-income, inner-city minority neighborhoods. Riverside Terrace and the segment of central Bel Air, Texas, cleared to build the West Loop South, stand out in Houston as places where the middle class also experienced the destructive consequences of freeway construction. Here is the Google satellite view of the 288 corridor today, with the highway right-of-way in yellow slicing through the Crescent Island subdivision, which is here, and the HEB McGregor Market built on the site of the Turner Estate. Deed restrictions in the sections of Riverside Terrace north of Bray's Bayou had expired in 1950. They were renewed, but only for 10 years. In 1960, the restrictions were not renewed and therefore lapsed. Large sites became attractive opportunities for garden apartment complexes. This ad illustrates the Parkview Chateau, built in 1963 on the site of the E.L. Crane Jacques Mosler House on North Calumet overlooking Riverside Park. The University of Houston sold the sites of the Malone and Schlumberger houses to developers who built apartment complexes on each. Without deed restrictions, the demiurge of Houston capitalism made its impact felt. Catherine and Harry Mott's turreted French chateau at 2612 Riverside Drive was sold by the University of Houston Foundation, to which the widow of its longtime resident, Greek immigrant restaurateur George P. Kelly, had donated the house to Lorene Young in 1969. 10 years later, Mrs. Young and her husband, Percy L. Ledette, erected the Ledette Motel surrounding the Mott House. On the perimeter of Riverside Terrace, a new landscape of black capitalism began to be developed, symbolized by chartering the Riverside National Bank, the first African-American owned bank in Texas. The bank's modern pavilion, completed in 1963, was the work of the first African-American licensed architect to practice in Texas, John S. Chase. This is a Chase family snapshot of the architect and two of his three children, Anthony on the left and John Jr. on the right. Standing in front of the house Chase completed for his family in 1959 in Oak Mere, a one-block subdivision off Tierwester, just east of the bigger Timbercrest subdivision. This is the Chase house, following the addition of a second story in 1969 that enabled Mr. and Mrs. Chase to entertain on an expansive scale, which, as David Heyman documents in his book, John S. Chase, The Chase Residence, was how the Chases sought to effect community change in Houston. In the late 1970s, scholarly curiosity impelled the historian, Dr. Barry J. Kaplan, a member of the first generation of Houston-trained academic historians, to research and critically examine local history, to sort through the traumatic stories of Riverside Terrace's transformation and put it into the broader context of urban change in Houston. The Houston-born, Los Angeles-based screenwriter and filmmaker John Schwartz interviewed both the storytellers and the historians for his now classic 1987 documentary, This Is Our Home, It Is Not For Sale, which is now available as a 5-part DVD. These were a pair of stills by cinematographer Judy Ewens from Schwartz's documentary, showing on the right Mr. and Mrs. Chase, and on the left, my friend Sherry Borgen, displaying a "This is our home, it is not for sale" yard sign, posted in the 1960s by Riverside families, attempting to resist the pressure on white families to sell and leave. Sherry stayed. A pair of recent Houston Protected Historic Landmark nominations for properties in Riverside Terrace: Rachel Paxton's for the Mayor Otis Massey House on Riverside Drive on top, and for the Sam Finger Lewis White House below, represent the efforts of individual property owners to seek historic designation as a way to preserve the architectural, historical, and cultural legacy of this distinctive Houston neighborhood. This is a photo I snapped in March of lawyer Sean Roberts talking about his plans for the Proler House on Riverside Drive, one of a number of architecturally significant properties Mr. Roberts has acquired. He plans to ensure their preservation, not by turning them back into single-family houses, but by exploring new commercial and cultural uses that will make them publicly accessible. The sections of Riverside Drive south of Brays Bayou remain largely intact because when the neighborhood's racial transition occurred in the 1960s, new property owners were careful to preserve the deed restrictions. What fascinates me about the relationship between the northern sections of Riverside Terrace and Olivia Erlanger's exhibition is how the unpredictable vicissitudes of history consistently undermine the myths with which suburban stability, privilege, and control are consistently sold, a point that Ms. Erlanger makes symbolically. Tomorrow collided with today in Riverside Terrace in the middle of the 20th century. What the neighborhood's survival attests to is the promise of tomorrow's tomorrow, which, if Sean Roberts has his way, will preserve the historic architecture of Riverside, but offer it a tomorrow that is more resilient and inclusive than yesterday's tomorrows. Thank you.